Today's show is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean offers the simplest, most developer-friendly cloud platform. It's optimized to make managing and scaling apps easy with an intuitive API, multiple storage options, integrated firewalls and load balancers, a new managed Kubernetes service, and much more. From predictable pricing to flexible configurations to world-class customer support, you'll get access to all the infrastructure services you need to grow your business. Plus, DigitalOcean's community provides over 2,000 tutorials to help you stay up to date on the latest open source software, languages, and frameworks. So to get started on DigitalOcean for free, with a free $50 credit, go to do.co/cloudcast. That's do.co/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Good to be back with everybody this week. Hope everybody is beginning to have a good summer. I know it's starting to warm up a little bit. We are now officially into summer. The longest day of the year has passed us by. Hope everybody's doing well. I want to get to some cloud news of the week. Not necessarily a super busy week with cloud news, but a couple of interesting things got announced this week. A couple of good outlooks on the market, perspectives on the market that I think are worth taking a look at. So first one that I had on my list this week was Mary Meeker, who for years and years has released her Internet Trends Report, has released the Internet Trends Report for 2019. So really good look from not just a VC's perspective. She's been very well known as a venture capitalist for years, but a very good perspective on kind of the state of the internet, the state of what goes on in terms of device usage, in terms of how we're spending our time on the internet, how that impacts things like advertising, but also, a lot of really good broad data on just kind of the state of the internet, how it's going on. So that's out there. We'll put that in the show notes. Always a very, very interesting read. It is over 300 slides with a whole bunch of data around it. So it definitely would be something that would take you a little while to dig through, but very, very good perspective that comes out every year. Sometimes worth looking at from year to year, doing some comparisons between years just to see what trends are happening and how trends have evolved over the last couple of years. So definitely take a look at that. The second one was something that got released by a company called Sonatype. Sonatype is pretty well known in the open source community space around testing, test within CI/CD environments, tests for developers and so forth. They released their State of the Software Supply Chain for 2019. That report came out. This is sort of important because I think as everybody is looking at digital transformation, DevOps, agile transformation, all these types of things that are about how do we build software better quality software, how do we build it in a more rapid way so that we can release new features without having to go through really, really long cycles and so forth. Understanding the software supply chain is a very, very important thing. So this is an interesting report. It's definitely worth taking a look at. What are the best practices that are out there? I sort of compare this type of report to sort of the State of DevOps report that comes out every year from Nicole Forsgren and Jez Humble and from others and so forth. So, definitely one of those types of reports that are definitely worth looking at. Third thing worth kind of keeping on your radar is KubeCon is going on over in China. Obviously, we cover a lot around KubeCon and Kubernetes over on the PodCTL podcast, but, KubeCon is becoming a very big event. It's become a very big independent event around Kubernetes, and the CNCF, which hosts the event, does a really good job of getting all of the talks, the keynotes, and so forth out published. So we'll get a link to their YouTube page, but they do a really good job of typically getting those out within a couple of days. So while there was a KubeCon in Barcelona a couple of months ago, a month or so ago, China has a very different perspective on things. So definitely worth taking a look at if you're interested in a global view of what's going on in Kubernetes. And then finally, the last thing that we had on our list, and I'm not even sure if this is newsworthy or if it's sort of a farce or how to kind of characterize this, but HPE was having one of their major events this year, and they had a keynote, and they introduced the term called cloudless, and got all sorts of ridicule on the internet from the clouderati and so forth. I believe the context of this was very much HPE trying to do that thing that hardware vendors do where they say, well, yes, there's public cloud and there's private cloud, but don't really think about the location of cloud. Think about the concept of cloud and how do you build cloud-like operations and so forth. But, the term cloudless now is introduced into our vernacular. We will see if it extends out there. Maybe that means this podcast goes away. I don't know. But something to definitely take a look at. I'll put it in the show notes. You can ignore it. You can ridicule it or, joke with it, or maybe it'll become a thing. We'll see. We'll see if it becomes something that a second company tries to adopt or some analyst picks it up and so forth. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. One last thing. Our friend Gene Kim just released a new book. Gene's been a longtime friend of the show. Just released a new book called The Unicorn Project. If you check out our Twitter feed, there's a link to the show or to the book in there. Always like to see Gene's stories. Gene does a very good job of talking about transformation, and the fact that he's gone back to the format of telling them in story format is very, very interesting, just like the Phoenix Project from years ago. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. We have sort of an interesting show this week. We're talking to Alexis Richardson, and we're talking about a topic that I think needs a little more attention. How do we become, as a industry as a whole, thinking about being greener in the things that we do? And this week, we're going to talk about what green means in the context of all of the events that we do all the time around the tech industry. So hope you enjoy the conversation. Alexis is a great guest, very knowledgeable, especially on the technical side, but good to see him becoming more and more involved with trying to make the industry better. So with that, we're going to get to our interview. Today's show is sponsored by Datadog, a cloud-scale monitoring and analytics platform. Datadog was built to bring clarity to complex, dynamic applications in the cloud, on-premises, in containers, or wherever they run. With powerful dashboards, seamless integrations into more than 250 technologies, Datadog provides deep end-to-end visibility into the health and performance of modern applications. And in July, Datadog is hosting Dash, a 2-day conference to learn about building and scaling the next generation of applications, infrastructure, and technical teams. So if you want to go to Dash, hang out with the folks from Datadog, and learn about all these cool new technologies, register today at dashcon.io/attend. That's dashcon.io/attend. And we're back. And, folks, as you know, if you are following the industry, as I expect you are, we're just finishing up kind of that part of the spring part of the conference season where a lot of events are going on around the world. A lot of major industry events as well as vendor events are going on. And one of the things I think that we're all kind of conscious about as we get on airplanes, get on buses, go take a bunch of stuff from vendors at conference shows is kind of a consciousness of what impact conferences have on both our industry, but more importantly, how it impacts the environment around us. And so, one of the things that's begun to pop up that I thought was interesting that I thought we would kind of explore, especially because it impacts everybody who's involved with either putting on events, attending events, and so forth, is, can we as a community give back and begin to lessen the impact that conferences have on our environment. So excited to have Alexis Richardson, who is both the CEO and founder of Weaveworks, but also chair of the technical committee for the CNCF. Alexis, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm no longer the chair of the technical committee for the CNCF.
All right.
I did do that for a few years. I was the first one, but now we are very lucky to have a new chair as of a couple of months ago, whose name is Liz Rice, and she's the lead evangelist at Aqua Security. Yeah,
and Liz is great. We've had her on the show. So you're still heavily involved with the CNCF, which is good. It's good, always good to have you at the shows. But we're going to talk a little bit about the shows themselves. You have been recently involved with a group of people who, are trying to be conscious about what's going on, the footprint of these conferences. So real quick, can you kind of wrap us up, kind of give us the Cliff Notes version of what got you interested in getting involved with, looking at the carbon footprint of conferences, and then, this group of people that are beginning to look at, maybe a code of conduct around how events hold themselves?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this began for me a long time ago when I first became of climate issues in the early 90s when I was at Sylhet University. And people talked about it a lot, and there was green politics, and I thought it was a single issue thing. And I'm sure there are many people listening who for whom this is the same. It was something that you kind of put at the back of your mind. But as time has gone by, it's become ever more obvious that this is something we can't ignore. We have to all take steps to think about it, and that starts with talking about it in our industry, which is famous for being not carbon neutral. In fact, there's a lot of data centers, computers, manufacturing, and overall waste around computing that I think we need to do something about. I don't know if you know this, but for example, the the Apple in-ear pods that, we all laugh at people wearing them because they look so silly, but they're actually also one of the world's least green efficient pieces of hardware. And if you buried them in a building site, they'd still be there undamaged thousands of years from now, because they're made to such high standards. And unfortunately, that means they're also very hard to get rid of.
Right.
So it's not just about carbon footprints, but it's also about our overall 360-degree posture as an industry towards green issues, carbon neutrality, and the environment. And so the question becomes, what's the right place to start? And I know that, having spoken to many people inside large organizations, that this is not something they're pretending doesn't exist. I mean, all the big cloud providers are obviously cautious about saying things in case they kind of get on the hook for something that they then get held to. But I'm pretty sure that all the big cloud providers are trying a lot harder than they may have said to be green. And then the rest of the industry, those of us who use data centers to do whatever we're doing, are also starting to become aware of this. So the question is, how do you bring these issues into the foreground? And what I found was that talking to people, conferences are where a lot of the lead buyers and lead vendors get together in our industry several times a year in order to talk about what we are doing with technology. So then the question becomes, why isn't this also the same place that we're talking about what technology costs to us as a society? And I found it very interesting that in the last 10 years, a group of people who I greatly admire have fought a tremendous battle to get the idea of a code of conduct adopted inside conferences to cover the ethics of how we as individual people work and treat each other, and to get a conference recognized as a legislated space that's safe, just as much as other environments are, like a work environment, so that there can be consequences for things like bad behavior towards one another, especially with regard to groups who've been discriminated against. And I thought that, there's all kinds of discrimination and inequality in the world. There's people who want access to technology. There's people who will suffer if there's a lot of global warming, like in third world countries, but they're not part of the conversation. How do we get that issue that affects them into the place where everybody goes to talk about technology? How do we get tech conferences to be the place where we talk about making the world safer, greener, and less unequal for people around the world? And so I thought, okay, if we can get people to hook into an issue that everybody understands, then we can have a code of industry conduct around that isn't just about how we interact with each other one-on-one, how I might relate to you, Brian, for example, but also how a sponsor or an industry vendor relates to their entire audience and all the people who are affected by their actions. And one-to-many type of obligation where, for example, I as a sponsor should come to a conference and I should talk about my carbon strategy. I should be obliged to be showing people that I'm making progress. I should publish the results of my improving data centers. I should share in techniques with other parts of the industry to become more green. I should use open source best practice and things like GitHub to share code and documents with other people in the industry, which allows us all together to improve scientifically and iteratively and quickly around how we are carbon neutral and how we just use less carbon as well. It's not just about being carbon neutral, it's also about just not burning things, not doing damage in the first place. And so, in conclusion, tech conferences are where people talk about these issues. Tech conferences have adopted these codes of conduct, which are about things like sexual harassment and protecting individuals who have been traditionally discriminated against, but they can also be a place where we have another ethical conversation about everybody together around the world who could be impacted by this, and this is a good idea. And so I started working with some people who were trying to create a draft document. We're still going a little bit round and round in terms of how to structure it, but ideally to get conferences to have a methodology in public they can buy into, such that A, they can get their speakers talking about their strategy for going more green, and B, they can help themselves and their attendees reduce waste and travel costs like carbon neutrality. So it's not just about carbon neutrality, but it's fundamentally about using these hotspots for conversation as places to cool things down in terms of the ecology.
Yeah, no, and I think it makes a lot of sense. It's like you said, we have this natural function within our industry where people come together, they talk about technology, they share ideas. We have an entire culture around, sharing software, transparency around what's going on. So it makes a lot of sense that, as you bring an issue to the forefront, that we might as well leverage the natural mechanisms that we have in place to get people together, to talk about it, to publish, best practices around doing that. Obviously, climate change, climate awareness is a big hot topic in political circles, both, in the UK, in the US, around the world right now. Do you feel like because that's being talked about more in mainstream media, that's what's kind of driving this from a timing perspective? I mean, you mentioned this has been a topic of interest to you for a long time, or do you think something else is driving why this is now coming up at this point in time versus, 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
I do think it's something where it's about timing. I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think that the data, the scientific data and the evidence that we're seeing published is becoming more and more compelling, and it's harder and harder to deny that not only is it dangerous, but also at critical levels already. So that's one factor. I think that also with the changing geopolitical scene and the move away from a kind of Clinton-Obama era consensus around trade as what people spend most of the time officially talking about, with occasional, unfortunately, wars around the world underpinning it, to a new world where there seems to be a kind of hostility or distrust between countries. And instead we read about tariffs being raised and people bullying each other at country to country level. I think people have started to focus more on geopolitics in the last couple of years. Yeah. And that's changing the recentering the conversation. And I think a third factor is that, honestly, going back to my point about being at university when this first became a big trigger issue in the 80s and 90s, we were too complacent as a generation about this, except with the exception of many notable individuals. But en masse, we were too complacent as a generation and didn't take it seriously enough and didn't do enough about it and rode happily on the coattails of growth. But there's a new generation of younger people for whom this is pretty insulting. And they are the ones who are starting to worry about being much more directly impacted by this. And they're starting to make a lot more noise about it. And I think that's great. So in London, for example, where I live recently, there were a lot of street protests, admittedly of a very kind of sedate middle-class white nature, perhaps you could say. Nonetheless, I think important because they really began to force into people's minds this is an issue, and that's been triggered by things like school protests. I mean, people taking days off school at the age of 15, 16 to show they're concerned about the environment and not accepting the kind of bullshit that we easily swallowed in my generation in the 90s and 2000s.
Yeah, no, makes sense. And like you said, timing is often everything in a lot of things, and sometimes it's the impact that it has on certain people that want to raise greater awareness than, like you said, maybe other generations. So you and a group of people have been working on what you're calling, at least initially, a climate code of conduct for events and so forth. You mentioned it's still in early stages. We put a link to it in the show notes so people can kind of take a look at it as a Google Doc, see the comments, see the structure. What are some of the big ideas that you're trying to get introduced into this, as you form your thinking around it?
I think the first thing is that we need to make sure the naming is right. So it's code of conduct. There's a lot of industry codes of conduct that have been around for a long time in various parts of the world and countries and industries. But within tech, the term code of conduct, especially open source and infrastructure, has become very closely associated with the ethics of how we behave to each other one-on-one as people, and the consequences of not adhering to those codes, especially as regards women and discriminated groups. So I think it's important to be incredibly respectful of that and build upon that in the right way. And so we need to be very, very sure that when we do talk about codes of conduct, it is in a way that's seen as a natural extension of that amazing work and not something that is in any way a distraction from that. because the last thing we want to do is distract from something that is helping people. The second thing is, I think it's important to unpack a little bit the different strands of what's going on here. So one of them is, how do we actually make conferences more green? How do we do carbon offsetting for air travel? And how do we help people just travel less so they don't have to offset in the first place? It's really important. Another area is, how do we get methodologies around improving practice here into the open, so that everybody who runs conferences can actually learn from one another, use software to report on measurements about how well or badly they're doing against their targets. And then from there, how do we get speakers and sponsors to commit to talking about their green strategy and also using and contributing to these methodologies? Because really, we've got to get to that point to have any kind of impact. At the end of the day, carbon offsetting for tech conferences is a tiny fragment of the carbon footprint that we need to deal with. What's much bigger is the global hosting costs of computers generally, and just the sheer amount of physical waste that's created just shipping them around and building them, throwing them away, and so on.
Right.
So really, we want to get the key goal is to get the conversation, the dial pointing at that issue, because that's the issue that's going to potentially have the chance to change the consensus. Everything else is a detail up until that point.
Right.
And the best that we can hope for through talking is to move the consensus. And one of the things that I felt was incredibly inspiring about the code of conduct work, especially by feminists, was to change the consensus. It is now simply unacceptable to do a tech conference, especially in open source, and not have a code of conduct. And people think it's really important, really serious, and it's a good thing. And it's a tiny scratch in the battle against the awfully toxic social nature of our industry, but it's an incredibly important step. So how do we change the consensus around green issues? So those are the things we're trying to focus on.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it sort of leads me to my next question is, in tech, we have a tendency to get enamored with the big change the world ideas, which obviously you need at times. Sometimes you need to set direction for people that is very broad, that goes in a new direction. There's other times when there are some basic simple things that we can address, sort of low-hanging fruit types of things. How are you kind of, finding that balance between setting a very bold direction, get data centers to neutral or other things, versus just kind of socializing, making them aware, making people aware, making them talking about it, the smaller things. What have you found so far is useful in that balance between people feeling like, okay, something is tangible enough, they can get involved, versus I'm really excited about being part of something much bigger, even though they can't individually solve it themselves?
Everyone can contribute individually to making a new level of understanding about what is right and wrong with regard to the use of carbon in tech. Everybody can. Nobody should feel excluded from that conversation. It is entirely reasonable to talk about it. It impacts everyone else in the world too. So I think they're all joined up. However, I think that we need to be realistic about what's achievable immediately versus what's achievable over time. And we need to also be careful not to do things that sound good, but hold people hostage to an unreasonable standard. So let me give you an example. Let's say that Amazon decided to make a public commitment to having, let's say, 75% of its data centers be green, whatever that means, according to some written definition, by the end of 2020. And then let's say they were in a position where they could acquire data centers and transform them to EC2 data centers. Well, then they might acquire data centers that were cheap and dirty and renovate them. But if they'd made a commitment to a certain metric of ecological carbon neutrality, let's say 75%, then they couldn't damage that by buying dirty data centers. So we'd actually have done a harmful thing by trying to get them to commit to something that they couldn't, that prevented them from cleaning up data centers. So there's an artificial example, but you can sort of see how you need to be super careful about the consequences of this stuff. And I also think that, whereas it's, one can imagine getting people to agree to not use harassing and discriminatory behavior themselves and be punitive about the consequences fairly quickly, it's going to take time for the industry to understand and adopt best practices for carbon neutral hosting and generally for improving compute overall. But what we can do in the short term is we can get people to really hook into the issue that we used to sort of start talking about this on Twitter, which is the air travel. And I think underlying that is the fact that a vast number of people actually feel bad about this already. They know it's an issue, and I think there's a silent majority of people desperate to talk about this and do something about it. You go to these big conferences and you're tired when you arrive. You see this huge space, you see so many people, you see these booths, which are going to get thrown away. You eat food and you think, where did this food come from? Where is it going? You see swag and you think, where's that going to end up? Is it going to be landfill? And these are issues that are in people's faces. So they're something that we can agree on right now and fix immediately. And if we can do that, then that starts to change people's minds about what it is okay to talk about at a tech conference. So that I think is the starting point.
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful, and I think like you said, it's important to start to get a terminology, a vocabulary out there that people are talking about. There's a consistency about it. Last question as we wrap this up, and there'll be things in the show notes again that people can kind of go dig into as they have interest in this. A couple of things. If anybody's interested in kind of participating in some of the early things that you're doing in terms of trying to define and outline, what's a good way for individuals to get involved? And then secondarily, if there's people that organize events that are listening to the show, what might be a good way, or who might be a good person for them to potentially engage with, to start thinking about, how do they bring this impact to their event or awareness to their event?
Well, we're going to publish some websites soon with some reports on what's going on and how data centers are working and practices and all these good things. But in the short term, just to keep it simple, just hit me up on Twitter. My username on Twitter is Monadic. If you do a search for that and Climate Code of Conduct or climate, you'll see there's some tweets, which includes draft Climate Code of Conduct, a survey that was a very basic amateur survey that I conducted, which taught me that the vast majority of people would like, for example, carbon neutral ticketing around conferences, just to take one simple example. And DM me or just at me, whatever you like, and ask me or tell me or just yell at me, whatever you want to do, anything you like. There's a bunch of other folks involved, and you'll be introduced to them immediately. But, at me on Twitter first.
Yeah, very, very cool. Yeah, and if you like I mentioned, the Climate Code of Conduct document that you guys are working on, we'll have a link to that in the show notes. You can see some of the other people that are already getting involved and making contributions. So as you mentioned, either reach out to Alexis or, begin to make some connections with those other people that are on there. So Alexis, thank you so much for, bringing awareness to the issue. We're glad that we can, give you a platform for talking about it. But more importantly, this is, like you said, an issue that will or is already impacting everybody that's around the tech industry. And it'll be good to see people get involved and start to make this part of the regular conversation of tech events, not just a once a year report or something that comes out. So with that, folks, thank you so much for listening. As always, I want to thank our sponsors, both Datadog and DigitalOcean, for sponsoring the show. And with that, we're going to wrap it up, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.